Let's bring in our panel to discuss the state of consumer sentiment. Joining us now, we've got Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst at Bankrate, and Sveta Kalinska, Consulting Founder and CEO of Real Global. Thank you both so much for joining us this afternoon. Happy to see you all on a Friday. Mark, I'll start out with you because I have not talked to you in a long time. Normally we'd be discussing jobs this Friday, but that's not happening. We do have the consumer sentiment data. Weaker than expected, the lowest level in more than 3 years. What's your take on this?
Good to see you again, Diane. It has been too long. Can you blame consumers for having a rather downbeat feeling with the government shutdown being emblematic of dysfunctional government in the United States and the real impacts that has on the economy, everything from food stamps to air traffic? And of course, less of a optimistic tone with respect to the outlook for inflation over the next year. You see where the damage has occurred, really where consumers are most downbeat is with the longer term outlook, with expectations down 36% from a year ago. It's less of a hit with the current situation. So job market obviously at some risk here. We wish we had better data on that. And as you said, we're sort of driving in the dark, looking at the GPS and hoping we don't hit anything.
Okay, yeah, hoping we don't hit anything. It sounds like that sounds similar to what we heard from Fed Chair Jerome Powell, like driving in a fog, so you slow down. Sveta, I know you also collect consumer data. What does your data show in terms of like how this compares to this latest consumer sentiment data that we're talking about here?
Good to see you, Diane. Listen, the data tracks and we see the same thing across the board. So when I analyzed the last 30 days of consumer discussions on social media, there were about 4 million posts that very clearly showed a pattern of economic anxiety that's very much tied to inflation and the overall cost of living. 33% of it was explicitly negative consumer sentiment as people expressed their frustration online. And listen, the core message was very simple and again, tracked pretty much with what we saw today, which is prices went up and they just never came back down.
Yeah, okay, that's a great point, because one of the things I notice about the weakness in this report is, of course, it's clear that it's impacted by the government shutdown, but it's the lowest level since 2022, and 22 is when, Mark, you'll recall, we saw that high inflation, peak inflation around the time. The University of Michigan survey director is saying this, quote, consumers perceive pressure on their personal finances from multiple directions. They also anticipate that labor markets will continue to weaken in the future and expect to be personally affected. I'm curious to know, especially because Bankrate also collects data as well, what you're seeing on that front about either consumers or the job market right now and any concerns around that.
I can tell you we will have some data on the outlook for 2026 on the part of consumers coming up next month. Look forward to checking in with you about that, Diane. But you look across the landscape and it's hard to come up with solid reasons to be optimistic or to change the outlook to a more positive take. And I think that's essentially what consumers are feeling here. They would like to be relieved of the burden of inflation, elevated prices, the result of inflation. They wish that the risk and the reality of tariffs would go away. And so there will be a point, I presume, in the not too distant future where the government shutdown is resolved, and there will be some prices to pay from that, including the fact that federal workers need to be restored with their pay. That's going to be a process. But even we get past that, we're still going to be dealing with this volatile environment, both economically and politically. Oh, by the way, we've got a midterm election year coming up.
Okay, yes, that's a good point. Sveta, I want to go back to you and get your thought on this. You talked about inflation and what you're seeing on that front and how it lines up with what you're seeing across different surveys, whether we're talking about this University of Michigan sentiment survey. I'm curious to know what you're seeing, if you're seeing data points on this yet, on how consumers are feeling about the upcoming holidays, which are coming faster than I think, well, at least I'm prepared for.
I did see that consumers actually discussed the holidays, of course, at a higher rate than in prior months as they were gearing up to spend some money when it came to holiday spending. One of the interesting things that I keep on seeing month over month, Diane, is actually that vehicles and anything related to vehicle conversations has been trending upward. And in the most recent discussions over the last month, I did continue seeing that consumers are pretty much ready to go and spend money on new cars and new vehicles in general. And they were both discussed for commercial vehicles and for personal use as well.
Mark, I want to go back to you and get your thought on this. You know, we often have this conversation about the K-shaped economy, and I know this stood out to you. Households with significant stock holdings saw sentiment rise, supported by market strength. What do you think that signals?
This bifurcated economy is as significant as we've seen. Perhaps, obviously, we did see a big part of that during the pandemic, but think about the divide between those who own homes, those who have significant exposure to the stock market, and essentially everybody else who do not have those things. And so I sort of resist the characterization within the economy of the consumer, because we're talking about many millions of consumers and their results may vary. And so, you know, the National Retail Federation came out with a prediction this week that essentially holiday spending should rise. Let's just put it in the middle of their forecast, about 3.9 or 4% year over year basis. Well, you adjust that for inflation, and that's, you know, very minimal increase. And so we know that wealthier individuals have accounted for about 50% of consumer spending. They'll again do a lot of the heavy lifting during the holiday shopping season. And then essentially you'll have the have-nots just struggling to make it.
All right. It's certainly a worry, I know, for a lot of people. We'll have to leave our conversation there for today. And hopefully we get some economic data sooner rather than later from the government, provided the shutdown ends soon. That's Mark Hamrick from Bankrate and Sveta Kolenska of Rela Global. Thank you so much. And